Hey, so yeah, my name's John O'Brien. I work over at TAFE New South Wales in the VR team over there. As was just said, I'm talking about basically the challenges and the journey I've taken going from a traditional 3D artist across to a VR technical artist. So just a little bit about me. I've got over 7 years experience in games and 3D design, both full-time and freelance. I've also had some time in project management and actually product management. Launched a medical device globally, which is a pretty awesome time. And now I'm back in the games industry. I'm also a proud founder of a failed games startup, which I say proud because I learned a hell of a lot from that experience. A little bit about the team as well. So I sit in the innovation team where we're kind of looking at a 3 to 5 year tech focus, very heavily focused on VR at the moment, but we also do a little bit of AR as well. We've also got a learning tech team and a learning analytics team that help support us as well. So as I mentioned before, I'm going through kind of essentially almost the lessons learned of the last 12 months of the journey that I've been on, going from a traditional background, both in games and product design, product rendering, to VR and what we've learnt along the way. This slide is one of my boss's favorites, and it is absolutely overwhelming when you first look at it. It was developed in conjunction with a US agency called We Discover, and it is crazy to look at all the different considerations that we might actually need to think about when we're trying to design a VR experience. In particular, I'm really going to focus down on the hardware and performance, of course, because it is VR and it is very painful, but particularly also the scale and space aspects and interaction design and how affordances affect that, as well as navigation, and I'm going to touch very briefly on audio. So getting the elephant in the room out of the way, optimization, targeting 90 frames a second as a bare minimum can be incredibly painful. I find in general the best approach is actually to start low and up-res if you've got space for it, rather than trying to go for a kind of a optimize later approach. You can get yourself into big holes if you start going too high too quick. The other thing to consider as well is post-processing. So we did quite a bit of testing up front about 6 months ago with post-processing. Managed to actually get quite a few of our experiences running with some post-processing effects, but we found that we could only run them on a minimum of a 1080 Ti, which really is just cutting out a huge band of the market, even in just the desktop space, not even considering mobile. So we've pretty much made the decision to just scrap all post-processing, which in this day and age is kind of hard. It's very challenging to try and work without it. But you can do a lot with your art style as well to try and save yourself some pain in the optimization stages later. My video's not playing. So this experience we got here was actually a great example of where we kind of got optimization for free. We designed a virtual childcare center AR app, which we then ported across to VR later. And because we started in AR, pretty much all we had to do was go back to our project files, our source files, and up-res the textures back from a non-baked lighting texture model. And we ported straight across to desktop VR without any issues at all. Probably the biggest key takeaway for that for me was to essentially consider both the optimized and the non-optimized versions as you're going through. So make sure you keep your source files at a higher resolution. Particularly with textures, work to a really high resolution and let Unity take care of the down-resing for you. It does a brilliant job of it. Another one was we designed essentially a virtual graduation hall. So it's essentially an auditorium. We originally designed it for the concept for a WebGL platform, which meant that we were actually able to drop it pretty much immediately onto the early dev kits we got for Quest, the new Oculus 6 mobile headset. The reason we were able to do that is because we basically designed the entire thing to use pretty much just flat materials with virtually no textures. That entire scene, I think, has 2 texture files in it. The rest of it's just colored materials and some interesting emissives for lighting to try and keep the space feeling interesting. So it's just another example of how targeting low in the beginning can actually be a massive help in the future. Even if you don't see the future yet, it may help you down the line. So getting back into the space and scale side of things, one of the things we've noticed straight up is that scale doesn't necessarily translate perfectly in VR. We always work to real world units, as I'm sure everyone does. But one thing we've discovered is sometimes you'll throw something into VR and it just doesn't quite work. You end up needing to rescale it and shift it around and move it. The other thing is, this is our an alpha of our virtual childcare in VR, trying to sort of demonstrate how you need to really think about teleportation and locomotion and any kind of navigation that you're doing in your level design. This was a space that worked really well in AR. It looks great in VR, but as soon as you start trying to teleport around, if you don't have large enough areas of nav mesh to land on, it makes it really hard, and you end up having people kind of trying to aim over objects and things like that. It's just a little bit tricky. What the key takeaway here really is just to actually test in VR and test as early as you can and test as often as you can. Just to make sure that things are working in the headset right along the way. Another thing we discovered as well was with animated characters. We've got a guide character in our induction, sort of our VR tutorial experience. And we originally animated him and discovered pretty quickly that he was actually coming out of the roof of the environment and landing in people's heads, which is obviously a little bit disconcerting if you have suddenly you're inside an object in VR. So to try and avoid that, we've sort of had to just think a little bit outside the box. The other issue we had as well was if we're trying to avoid a player, our platform that we use, the Immersive platform, is actually multi-user. So if I avoid one player, am I going to crash into another player? How do I deal with that unique challenge? Where we actually landed with it was obviously to reanimate Roger straight away so that he wasn't coming out of the roof and crashing into people's heads, leaving him a little bit higher up in the space. Create a little script to rotate him around, nice simple little script. In terms of the multi-user stuff though, we actually basically decided to not synchronize him. So every player actually sees their own version of Roger. The reason for that is if he's avoiding me, then Joe is standing over there. He could crash into Joe's head as far as I see it, but Joe won't see that. Joe's version will be standing over here, probably crashing into my head. So while there's a slight jarring issue there, if you see him pass through someone else's head, it doesn't give you that same issue of being inside of an object. Moving on to interactions, there's hundreds of different interaction types. Everything you can possibly think of. The list is basically endless, and most of the VR SDKs out there have a lot of them bundled in from scratch. In general, we find that the best thing to do is to essentially try and just mimic the real world as much as possible. Particularly with VR, because you're in the headset, because you're fully immersed, because you can see virtual representations of your hands in the space, generally people will find it very intuitive and very easy to get the hang of it if you're using something that makes sense in the real world as well. And that's particularly important for anyone who's a non-gamer or a VR, new to VR in particular. One thing we did discover along the way as well was we had some dials in our induction experience, which were quite small, and it required sort of a twist of the wrist action in order to be able to turn those dials around, and it was very, very difficult for most users to actually get their head around that. We ended up changing them over to sort of basically just a flip switch, and we saw almost an immediate change in the ease of use of people getting through the experience. you'll see just as that loops back around, there's actually another dial in the experience which is still in there. Just because it's ever so slightly larger, it makes it a lot easier for people to actually turn it. And particularly like very large dials are even easier again, because you're almost using kind of a wheel turning motion to be able to get them around. One of the other issues that these small dials presented for us as well was that having too many colliders too close together suddenly becomes a massive problem. So we actually have there's an asset available in the asset store called Collider View, which is really, really helpful for diagnosing issues that you might be having with collisions, particularly with things that are closer together, some things that might be overlapping. The main reason for that is the fact that you can actually use it in the game view, so you can see it when you're in the headset, rather than being, just relying on the scene view in Unity. Because obviously, when you're in VR, even when you're testing, you're not going to be able to see the scene view. You can only see the game view because you're completely blocked off from the world. The next interaction I really want to talk about as well is menus. So we, in general, try to contextualize as many of our menus as possible. Basically, what I mean by that is making sure that any traditional kind of 2D style menu systems are actually embedded in the real world. They actually have a real world representation, something like a touch screen or a phone, getting away from this idea of having a straight blocked out traditional kind of gaming two-dimensional UI. And in the virtual graduation at the end of this as well, not only do we have the lectern with the lighting controls built into it, we actually have a slide clicker as well. So it's just like presenting in the real world. You grab your slide clicker and you click through. You can walk around on the stage, and it's kind of just freeing a little bit opening. It makes it a little bit more open for people. The other thing as well, this is from the Climb, and it's just a reminder to just not forget about the third dimension. When you are designing menus, it's really important to kind of get your mindset out of that sort of two-dimensional space. And the last bit as well is the exit burrito from Job Simulator. It's just a wonderful outside of the box kind of idea for how you would tackle a menu in VR. Rather than being a simple click button or a menu, you physically eat the burrito in order to exit the game. Which has the wonderful side effect of being able to actually have a confirmation by taking a second bite, or a cancel by just throwing it in the bin. And the other major things we've come across as well is just kind of the question of whether to go controllers or hands inside the experience. And also the guys from Job Simulator actually coined the term tomato presence, which is essentially when your hand, basically when you pick up an object, your hand disappears and the object you're holding becomes your presence in the world for where your hand is in your physical space. So there's a lot of we've kind of tried out a lot of different versions of this, bounced around between the original of the Steam VR, hands and controllers in the same thing, which people found just horrendously confusing, especially people who'd never come across a gaming controller or something like that in their lives. The idea of being able to pick something up and having it floating on the end of a controller rather than being physically in your hand is just a bit disturbing. When we moved to the Immersive platform, we had that tomato presence concept. So there's hands, no controllers, and that allows people to, most people seem to find it fairly intuitive, but when you initially get into the experience, especially as a new VR user and particularly a new gamer or a non-gamer, you don't know what buttons you're pushing because you can't see past the headset to actually be able to see it. So we're at this point sort of thinking that we'd like to introduce the controllers to people first, then transition to hands, and then when we transition to hands, actually have fully custom poses and get away from that kind of tomato presence so that you feel a little bit more like it's actually your real hand. So when you pick something up, you actually have a pose that holds that object the way that you would in the real world. One of the most important things I can talk about with interactions is the idea of affordances. And the simplest way I can explain this in the context of VR is that users will have a tendency to expect objects in VR to work the way they do in the real world. So if you mimic the real world in your interaction design, generally people are going to find it a lot easier, and there's not going to be a learning curve to get through there. One of the side effects of this is that objects really need to be very, very obvious, and obviously what you intend them to be. This is one of our plumbing safety experiences. when we originally designed it, we had this is a dishwasher and this over here is an oven. And so essentially what you're doing is you're trying to determine where the water pipe, which of these pipes in the wall is the water and which is the gas, based on which one is the dishwasher, and you can follow the pipe running back there. The issue we had was no one could tell which one was the dishwasher. They just thought it was an oven and another oven. So we had to switch out to a model that was a lot more obvious, to the point where we even have a label on the front of it of the name of the product being the Dishmatic, just to make it bleedingly obvious what we're talking about when we say the dishwasher. Another thing that was an issue in plumbing again, and in a few of our other experiences as well, is the idea that affordances mean that if people in VR see a button, see a handle, see anything, they want to interact with it, they expect to be able to interact with it. The solution to this problem, it seems pretty simple, is basically just make everything interactive. Sometimes that is practical, and what we've done in our childcare alpha is essentially make literally every object in the world completely interactive. You can play with the puzzle boards, put them together, you can pick things up and throw them around, and it's quite a fun, wonderful environment. In plumbing, which is a bit more of a serious experience, we needed to kind of think of a different solution to the problem. So we actually took a leaf out of Alchemy's book. The guys who made Job Simulator, they made the Rick and Morty experience. And in there, they basically had a gag handle for a door that you couldn't open. So now if you grab the dishwasher handle, it basically spits out a random message, something along the lines of, don't go breaking other people's stuff. So we just tried to make it a little bit fun, a little bit interesting, without necessarily having to actually solve for that problem of making everything completely interactive. One of the most important aspects of VR is definitely spatialized audio. Thankfully, I don't actually have to think much about this because we have an amazing audio engineer in our team. It does a great job of putting together all of our spatialized content using the Oculus spatializers. What it's shown us, though, is we've come back to adding our audio quite late in a lot of our experiences, and we've actually had to redesign some of our levels and reposition some of our objects within the world because it didn't make sense from a spatial audio perspective where the audio source was. So if you have a TV in the world that's projecting a sound into the world, you need that audio source in Unity to match where it needs to be. We've actually had to, as I say, move a few things around just to make up for that. To make that make more sense. So one thing I would definitely say is just consider your audio far, far earlier in the piece and consider how your audio might influence your level designs and even your object designs. The other thing that we've discovered is incredibly important is just continually consider non-gamers. VR is still ridiculously exciting and amazing and everyone wants to try it. You've only got to walk into a showcase like we've got today and just see how many people are willing to chuck on a headset. People from the age of 5 right up to 90 will want to give it a go. The challenge there is that if you're relying on traditional gaming affordances, the things that we come to rely on in the industry, the fact that people know how to use a controller, people know how to work through an interactive experience, you're going to run into problems. So generally, use those real-world affordances, make sure that things make logical sense from a real-world perspective, but also don't forget to make things challenging but easy, which of course I know is an oxymoron, but it is very important to just make sure that you're keeping people engaged by making it quite challenging. And I think that probably the best example of that as well is our plumbing experience. I've seen people at events like this sit there for 15 minutes trying to get the procedure correct, even though they have no experience of plumbing whatsoever. They just love the fact that, well, they get stuck in this bug, they get this bug of just wanting to get it right and wanting to not fail. One of the things to keep in mind as well is that people will pick up VR very, very fast, especially if your experiences are good, but they'll drop it just as fast if your experiences aren't good. So focus on interaction design, make sure you get that right from the start. So in terms of my kind of key takeaways or my key advice to any artists who may want to kind of get into VR, VR does require a little bit of a leap of faith. If you're new to it, if you haven't really experience it very much, the best advice I can possibly give you is just jump in head first, get a headset, just start experiencing as many things as you can, explore as many things as you can, and just get into creation right now as well. Even if you don't have a technical background, there's amazing assets available in the asset store, and plugins and SDKs like Spatial Stories and VRTK are a great way to get into it, even if you don't have a technical or programming background. That's definitely where I started. I would not have considered myself a dev 12 months ago, but now I pretty much do consider myself at least a junior dev, if not a, definitely technical artist. And that's mostly on job learning, and some of the tools like the Spatial Stories, which is a really good way to ease into that programming side of the world. The other thing to consider as well is apps like Sketchbox and Microsoft Maquette, and some of the other VR creation tools out there are really very fun, very easy to get your head around, and they're a great way to start creating content and just getting comfortable with the idea of creating content for VR. The other thing is just collaborate as well. So if you know some devs, get in with them. If you're an artist, if you're a dev, go and just find some artists and just start creating. If you can find people who are willing to bring you onto a project, just jump in the deep end and learn as you go. Oops, sorry. So I actually had very little, if not no, VR experience before starting. Thankfully, my boss kind of took a chance on me. But it's not hard. Sorry, it's hard to catch up, but it's not impossible. So you can definitely get there, but it's getting harder and harder to get work in work in VR without having quite a lot of experience. So if you are interested in it, definitely get into it in your personal project work and just create as much as you possibly can. And it's also very experimental. So just be agile. Make sure that you're evolving with the times, keeping up with hardware changes, and anticipate and expect absolute constant change, because what's working today won't be working in 12 months' time. There'll be something bigger and better and something we want to move on to. So learn to work harder, work smarter, not harder. Use plugins and tools where you can, and don't be afraid to experiment. And also learn to kill your darlings. One of my 2D animation and drawing teachers at uni basically told us to go home and find our favorite piece of artwork we'd ever created and tear it up, which I actually did, and it was the best decision I ever made, because it really does just teach you to let go of your work and not get too precious about things. So yeah, in conclusion, just if you're interested, get into it now. Anticipate change and learn to be agile. Test constantly and test in VR. And probably the best piece of advice I can give any artist, whether you want to get into VR or not, is just go and take a programming 101 class. You really won't regret it. It'll make you so much more fluid in your professional life, and will even just help with communication with devs as well. So, thanks for that. If there's any questions, feel free to ask.